The subject of the talk is Lord Sydney, and I apologise for the quality of this particular image, but that's the gentleman up there that I'm going to be talking about. There are images similar to that one in this building. That is actually a copy of an image which, or a painting rather, which is up at the Mitchell Library, and it was painted by Gilbert Stuart, who also painted George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. He was the great portrait painter of the late 18th century. One thing about it that I think says a lot, and you've got to be careful with portraits which are commissioned, and this one was. I want to say commissioned, what I mean is that the person who sits for the portrait pays the artist to paint it, because the artist's always going to paint, one would think, a relatively sympathetic image. So I suppose one point I would make, he's not exactly the most handsome looking guy in the world. Even in that portrait, what he must have looked like in real life is an interesting question. But what interests me about the portrait though is that by this time he was Lord Sydney. So he was a baron and he was entitled to wear a red robe with ermine guards, they call them, horizontal stripes, and gold on top of the horizontal stripes as a member of the House of Lords. And all his colleagues who would have been painted in that rank, so to speak, would almost invariably have been wearing their robes, like somebody wearing full uniform or whatever. And I think it's particularly significant that Sydney was wearing a simple black coat, and that actually tells me something about him. So who was he? Well, his real name was Thomas Townshend, Townshend with an H, and because his father was also called Thomas Townshend, he was called Young Tommy. And he went into the House of Commons at the age of 21, where his father was also a member, and so he was known as Young Tommy around the corridors of Parliament. Now, I had a few nicknames when I was in Parliament. One, Morris Yema used to call me the Chainsaw, which I didn't mind, and other people used to call me Tinkerbell, which I minded a little bit more. So these nicknames can become weapons, and I think by the time he was in his 50s, being known around the traps as Young Tommy was probably wearing a bit thin. When I say got into Parliament 21, the Townshend family were one of a small group of families that basically ran Great Britain in the first half of the 18th century. There were the Pitts, there were the Walpoles, there were a couple of other families, and the Townshend's one of the great families. And his father basically owned the seat, which Townshend took at that young age. What do I mean by owned the seat? Well, first of all, there were about 70 voters in it. I could only dream of a seat with 70 voters. It's about double the number of people in this room, I would say. And all of them were in his father's pocket. So the idea was that they voted through a property qualification. His father owned all the properties in this electorate where there were a sort of a voting entitlement attached. And he put sympathetic people into these properties as tenants just before the election. They'd go and vote and they'd all go away again when the election was over. Now, if you think this was rorting, that wasn't actually a bad example. The worst example was Old Sarum, which for a while had 7 voters, and then after a landslide, when part of it fell into the sea, it had no voters, and still returned a member to the House of Commons. So a very different system. And he did what most backbenchers do who want to get on, which was he kept his head down, he kept his mouth shut, and he made himself useful. Which is to say, he didn't do what Craig Thompson's been doing recently, or dare I say, when he was on the backbench, somebody to be bipartisan about it, somebody like Barnaby Joyce. It's worked out differently for those two fellows. But he did have that sort of traditional backbench approach to getting on. And things went well until the early 1760s when British politics was turned on its head. Now, we might think today that we live in fairly turbulent political times. To give you an idea, between 1760 and 1770, there were 7 British Prime Ministers in 10 years. So what was going on? Well, first of all, there was a new king on the throne, George III, a young man in his 20s. His grandfather and great-grandfather before him, who were his immediate predecessors, spoke German as their first language. In fact, George I couldn't speak English at all. And in that way, the prominent members of the British Parliament, including the Townsends, had, so to speak, got more of the balance of power out of the king than the other way around. And so George III was determined to get some of this balance back in favour of the monarchy. And he undertook that by trying to find ministers who would help him, which meant an end to the Townshend family's influence. The other thing that was going on was Britain had just won a very big world war. Winston Churchill later called it the First World War, which was, as we call it here, the 7 Years' War, or in the United States they call it the French and Indian War. Now, it's like other world wars which Britain has won subsequently. They win the war and they lose the peace, by which I mean to say they end up with massive bills they've got to pay, war debts and so forth. And this war was no different. So the government was looking to raise money to pay war debts, and they looked to the American colonies, and they started trying to tax the Americans. Well, Tommy went along with this for a while. He was, again, that sort of, by this stage, junior minister, still needing to look out for himself and do what he was told. And by 1768, he got into a minor but lucrative ministry called the Paymaster General of the Forces. And the Paymaster General was responsible basically for paying the army, paying all the soldiers. And it was lucrative because until the soldiers were paid, the paymaster could invest the regimental balances to his own account. So he'd be able to keep and pocket the interest of all the money that was to be paid out to the soldiers. Now, we've got the ICAC and various other bodies which would send an MP to jail for that now, but in those days it wasn't illegal. And during wars, when the army was very big, paymasters general became millionaires in 18th century pounds, shillings and pence terms. So it was a sought after ministry because of the money involved. And in 1768, when Tommy got himself on the wrong side of a factional dispute, the winners of the factional dispute came after him and said, "We want that paymaster generalship." And so he was forced to give it up. He was offered something else, but he stormed off in high dudgeon and resigned all his positions. He said it was on a point of principle. Beware of politicians who resign on a point of principle. There's usually no such thing involved. It's usually, some sort of hurt feeling which is wrapped up in some public interest idea. And so I think it was with him. But what was it that he said he was resigning over? He was resigning in support of the American colonists. That was his principle. And later he genuinely came to believe in it. And as the British government descended into open war with the American colonists, he became one of just a very small number of MPs who supported the Americans. So the House of Commons was 558 members, and only about 50 of them supported the Americans, and of them only about 20 turned up to Parliament and were prepared to speak out about it, and Tommy Townsend was one of them. And I've been in that situation where you're in a small opposition against a government that's rampaging around all over the place with the numbers, and it is a very, very uncomfortable place to be at times. And you need your heroes. And he had a hero. So who was this hero? Well, his name was Algernon Sidney with an I, and that's the gentleman. So who's this guy? Well, he lived in the 17th century. He fought on the side of Parliament during the English Civil War, and after the Civil War and after Cromwell's demise, there was this contest that went on between the King and Parliament after the Restoration about the power of the King versus the power of Parliament. And things remained in a great state of flux for the next 20 years. And he was a great supporter of the Parliament against the King. And we're talking here Charles II. He wrote a book called Discourses on Government. He basically was asserting that the power of the King was subject to the will of the Parliament. And for that he was executed for treason, tried, sentenced to death and executed. The penalty was to be hung, drawn and quartered. You've all probably just had lunch, so I'm not going to explain that punishment. I'll just put it this way, that the King took pity on him and cancelled that punishment and said, "I'm just going to behead you alone," in an act of leniency. So when you take into account that beheading was an act of leniency, you'll get an idea of what hanging, drawing and quartering involves, and perhaps late this afternoon, but well before dinner, if you want to Google it, you'll see what I mean. Now, Sidney was very, very influential, and this book that he was executed for writing, Discourses on Government, later became very influential with the American colonists. And to give you an idea of how influential, Thomas Jefferson credits Algernon Sidney with being one of about 3 people who were his inspiration for the Declaration of Independence. One was Aristotle, I think from memory. Another one was John Locke, who lived in Algernon Sidney's time and was much more readable than Algernon Sidney. Locke is still relatively easy to read today, which I think is why he's better remembered, whereas Sidney's almost impenetrable. But he did say this in Discourses on Government: "Nothing can be more evident than if many men had been created, they had all been equal." And Thomas Jefferson, of course, says in the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal," which are probably the most famous words in the English language. The fact that Jefferson was a slave owner and probably a supreme hypocrite for writing that stuff is another matter. But that's just try and give you a sense of how influential this man was. So what's it all got to do with Tommy Townsend? Well, Tommy was under the pump supporting the Americans during the Revolutionary War, and looking for heroes, he looked to this guy, because this guy had stood up for Parliament against the King, just as Townsend was doing the same during the American War, standing up to George III, who by this time was assuming more and more power against the Parliament with the help of a compliant Prime Minister, Lord North. So Townsend really got inspiration from this martyr. And later on that will become very significant, and it's very significant for this city for a reason I'll explain a little bit later. But just remember that name, Sidney with an I. So the war raged on. At first of all, it was very popular with the English public. They were all pro-war, which is why Townsend and the others had such great difficulty in Parliament, and why on a couple of occasions observers from France thought he might actually be sent to the Tower of London. That didn't happen, but he was very much on the outer. I think what happened with the Revolutionary War, just in summary, is much like what happened in Vietnam. Over time, people came to understand the war was unwinnable on the British side, and they got tired of paying taxes to keep the war going. And this groundswell of public opinion grew, and the government found that it was really incumbent upon them to find a way out. The King was resisting, however, and wanted to keep going. It all came to a head after the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, where Washington defeated a big British army, and the government decided to sue for peace. Because it had been such a strong wartime government, it then fell. And in the government that came in, Tommy Townsend became Secretary of State for Home Affairs in the new government. Now, this next slide, I think, it's one of the most interesting slides, or one of the most interesting documents I came across. I spent a month at the Clements Library in Michigan, in the United States, looking at Sidney's papers. Why are they there? Because the Clements Library collects the British side of the American Revolutionary War, and Townsend, for his role that I'm about to outline, was considered a very significant figure. And so that's why they've got his papers, which they bought on the cheap after World War I. What this is, you can disregard the right-hand side, but down the left-hand side, this is the establishment of the Home Office in 1782, I think it is. What do I mean by that? That is a list of everybody who worked in the Home Office, the full departmental staffing list. And up the top you've got the Secretary of State, Lord Sidney, and down the bottom you've got the Night Porter. And one up from the Night Porter is the Necessary Woman, and the Necessary Woman is a cross, I think, between a tea lady and a cleaner. And then working up from there you've got a number of clerks, until you get 2 names down from Sidney, is a very famous name, Evan Nepean, whom the Nepean River is named after, and who's a major figure in Australian history for his involvement in the First Fleet and one thing and another. 18 of them ran the British Empire. When I come through the turnstile, the swinging red thingamajigs down at Wynyard Station, there are more than 18 people down there collecting tickets or working somewhere in the station. So this is actually a very, very dangerous document to people who are interested in cutting back on the public service. It's not a document, I won't say who, it's not a document you'd want to fall into certain hands, various people who are in government. But it's remarkable, I think, that 18 people ran the British Empire in London. Of course, it was very different then. They relied on delegated authority, which is to say governors in those days, like Arthur Phillip and others, were far more powerful than they are now, and the empire worked because of the authority governors had in the various colonies. And this was basically a letter and dispatch clearing office, although policy was made in this office and went straight through to the cabinet from here. So he becomes Home Secretary with these 17 people working for him, and the first big item of business is what to do with the Americans. And because the colonies were still seen as British in British eyes, they fell within the jurisdiction of the Home Office, which then as now had a very significant responsibility for the internal government of Great Britain, if I can put it that way, but it also had responsibility for the colonies. There was no colonial secretary in those days. And that being the case, it fell to Lord Sydney to oversight the peace negotiations with the Americans. The negotiations took place in Paris. He didn't go there, but he was responsible for oversighting the people who did go there and for taking to Cabinet and arguing through Cabinet the final positions that were taken on the peace treaty. Now, I said he'd been pro-American, but what happened was a new constituency emerged. And believe me, from somebody who spent some time in Parliament, new constituencies matter, and they can actually change your views on things. And after all, that's democracy in a way. You're there to be responsive to people, and that's what happened to him. So who was this constituency? They were called Loyalists. They were Americans who'd fought for the king. And they were saying to him, you've got to help us. We're being run off our properties by the Americans. Places are being burnt, our livestock's being killed. In the worst cases, we're being killed, and we're being forced out of what's now the United States. So in effect, there was this massive refugee problem, and Sydney had to do something about it. Some of the refugees were very influential. One of them was called William Franklin, who'd been a royal governor of New Jersey, and he carried a lot of clout. Ironically, he was the son of Benjamin Franklin, who was one of the great Republican patriots, and father and son never spoke to each other again after the commencement of the American Revolutionary War, as often happens tragically in revolutionary wars and civil wars. So what did he do? There was an idea put forward at one stage that the Loyalists should come here. Botany Bay had been discovered in inverted commas by James Cook, and that suggestion was floated. But it never had legs, A, because there was not the shipping available to send the Loyalists here, and B, and more importantly, they didn't want to come here. And they didn't want to come here, I think, because they hoped to go home. That's to say, they hoped to be able to reunite with their families in the United States later on, and that's in fact what happened in a lot of cases. When things calmed down, a lot of them managed to get back to New York, which was one of the most anti-loyalist states immediately after the Revolution, and also Massachusetts, and they did go back after time. But in the short term, this was his big problem. So first of all, the negotiators were told to try and get Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, who was the second president of the United States later, who was in Paris, to see reason. This didn't happen. And so Sydney's fallback position was, well, we've got to find somewhere for these people to live. And if it's not Botany Bay, we've got to find somewhere in North America. And so the issue of the boundary between what's now Canada, in those days called British North America, and the United States became a critical issue in the negotiations. Now, when you think about it, the United States is to the south, and I'll call it Canada. Canada is to the north. So the further north the boundaries are, the better it is for the United States. The further south the boundaries, the better it is for Canada. And bear in mind that even on the Canadian boundaries today, you only have to go a couple of 100 miles north of where they are, and you're in country that is uninhabitable, especially in winter. I mean, there are ice floes, there are polar bears. It's seriously difficult country to live in. The Congress wanted the boundary to be as far north as possible, and Sydney as far south as possible. The negotiators on the British side were not at this time, they hadn't been appointed by Townsend, they'd been appointed by his predecessor. He didn't think we're doing a tough enough job, and so he sent over a fellow called Henry Strachey to put a bit of stick about. And The end result was that the boundary was settled not where the Congress had wanted it to the north, but through the Great Lakes. Now, I'm sure many of you have been to the Great Lakes. Go to Niagara Falls, there's an international boundary there. I was on the Canadian side once and was stupid enough to cross one of those bridges, which is an international boundary, leaving my passport in the car. And even though the Americans are great allies of us, I had a very difficult few hours trying to explain my way out of it. So it is a boundary for those who don't pass easily back and forward. And the boundary runs through the Great Lakes because of what Henry Strachey insisted upon at Townsend's instruction. What's this mean? It means that Toronto is a Canadian city, not an American one, because of the boundary Townsend insisted on, and it means there are about 8 million people who are Canadians, not Americans, because that small area of southern Ontario is in fact in Canada and not in the United States. And I personally think it's very difficult to contemplate the Canadian nation without those 8 million people in Toronto being a part of it. Now, the King, having been very irritated by Townsend for his opposition to the war, was now very grateful to him, and he offered him a peerage. And Townsend, of course, said yes, and then the King said, well, what name do you want? And Townsend said, I want Sydney with an I, after that bloke. And then the King says, all right, then a couple of days later, and by the way, I should have mentioned before that Algernon Sidney wasn't just his hero, he was actually his great-great-uncle as well. Townsend was directly descended from one of this fellow's sisters, a lady called Lucy Sidney, who was his great-great-grandmother, something like that, great-grandmother. So he said Sydney with an I. And then a couple of days later he had to come back to the King and say, well, that's not going to happen because members of the family are upset that I want to take the name, so I'm going to take Sydenham, as in the railway station. And then he came back a little bit later and he said, I've got it, I've spoken to the family again, they have no objection if I take Sydney with a Y, which is closer to the name I originally intended, and so Sydney with a Y it is. And that's how this city, in a roundabout way, bears that name of Algernon Sidney, which, if you're a Republican, is a good thing because it's the great Republican name. It is the great Republican name in English history. If you're a monarchist, perhaps it's not such a good thing. I don't know, but I'm out of politics. I just float these ideas without going anywhere near them. I should just show you one extra slide here if I can get it going before I move on. That is actually the yellow line is the boundary which the American Congress wanted, and the red line is the boundary which Townsend actually got in place. And that little triangular area down there is in fact where 8 million Canadians live and where Toronto's located. And the red line does sky off to the left, but it's pretty much tiger country up there even today, and it's in that sort of very difficult, well, not marginal agricultural area, but very low population sort of area, like Western New South Wales, but for different reasons. But when you turn the Canadian map around for very different reasons, they have sort of similar population densities to us, I think. Often thought that. And this one, this is a slide of a draft article, and that's Tommy Townsend's handwriting, for the Lord, taken from the Lord Chancellor. That's actually a draft of Article 5 of the American Peace Treaty in his hand, where they try to get good terms for the Loyalists. And that was one of the first attempts, which wasn't successful, but they did better later on with the boundaries. Now, this image here is of Sydney, Nova Scotia, painted in about 1785, 1786, and the Loyalists, grateful for what Sydney had done for them, named Sydney, Nova Scotia after him, and that's what it looked like in the early days. Now that must have been taken in high summer, because in winter you can literally walk across that harbour. It's got about 4 feet of ice on it, and it is called Sydney Harbour, and they do have a North Sydney and all that sort of thing, but it's not the same sort of place other than that. And there's this great little story about a young couple who had just gotten married and they were going on their honeymoon, and they lived in the Midlands of England, and so they went to the airport and said, we want to go somewhere nice and warm, and they went to one of those cut price airlines, EasyJet, you know, the ones that they have on TV, the TV shows about EasyJet and so forth, and said, we want to go to Sydney where it's warm. They got on board this plane, and after what appeared to be a suspiciously short flight, they got off at the other end, and because of course up there it was midwinter, they were looking for the warmth of Sydney, they got the 4-foot pack ice. So, you know, that just is rammed home to me, the difference.
Is there somewhere in Canada with Sydney with an I?
Oh, there are plenty of places with Sydney with an I, and that's because Algernon Sydney was a great hero to them long before Sydney with a Y became important. Not to the Americans, of course, but to the Canadians. So Algernon's one of those great figures in the United States. Out of fashion now, but 100, 150 years ago, he was a great figure, and there are all sorts of places called Sydney with a Y as a result. The other big problem Sydney had arising out of the revolution was what to do with the convicts. And there were various suggestions about where to send them. And I say Sydney was what I call a soft touch. And this governed the decision that he made. What do I mean by that? Well, George III was responsible for pleas of clemency. So if somebody was sentenced to death, they had a right of appeal to the king who could commute their sentence of death. But the public servant, so to speak, who took the papers to the king was the Home Secretary. And Sydney was a soft touch in the sense that he never wanted to hang anybody. And George III got pretty angry with him and said at one stage, we've got to hang a few of them just to make an example. And to give you an idea, there's one letter I found which is written by a minister of religion, the Reverend Charles Hardy, to Sydney, and it says, I'm told you've now obtained a pardon for a man convicted of the horrid crime of wilful murder. Do I live in a country where a Secretary of State can in effect annul our laws? So I think to myself, back in the days when I used to rant and rave about law and order, I would have been further to the right than Lord Sydney. I'm not joking. And if the fellow was alive today, he wouldn't pass the Ray Hadley test. You get my drift. But this was actually quite important because he believed he owed a duty of care to the convicts, and the location where they were to be sent had to be fit for purpose. Why? Because a number of them were sentenced to 7 years or to 14 years, after which they could resume life as British subjects. And so it was his duty to give them a reasonable chance of doing that. So they couldn't just be taken somewhere and dumped. By a process of elimination, various African destinations were eliminated as not being suitable. Survey ships were sent to reconnoitre the various suggestions that were made, and on each occasion the word came back that to send people there for one reason or another would be a death sentence. And so by elimination they came to Botany Bay as a proposition. It was far too far away to send a survey ship to because the pressure was on to find a political solution. And so Sydney relied on what Joseph Banks and James Matra told him, because both of them had been here with James Cook. And they said, this is a fit place to send convicts. They will survive, they will be okay. Sydney had his doubts. When Banks said 1 year's supply will do, Sydney doubled it to 2 years. And he also spent £58,000 on the First Fleet. You say, what's that mean? Well, it doesn't mean anything alone as a figure, so I make a comparison. I compare the First Fleet with the Second Fleet. The First Fleet, 1,000 people came out here, about 750 convicts and 250 Marines. Second Fleet, organised after Sydney retired, 1,500 people on board, which is to say 50% more. The money that had been spent on the First Fleet became a political issue. The Cabinet were keen to cut costs. All cabinets, by the way, are keen to cut costs. Don't ever believe anything else. And a new young up-and-comer had become Sydney's replacement at the Home Office, 29-year-old William Grenville, very keen to make his mark. I'll say another thing, be very afraid of young cabinet ministers. They're very dangerous people. I don't think anybody should be appointed to cabinet who's under 45. Anyway. And he issued the directive that the Second Fleet go out with least expense to the public. So a firm of slavers were employed, Camden, Calvert and King, and the Second Fleet came here for £22,000. That's to say, less than half the price of the First Fleet, carrying 50% more people. It was a catastrophe. 275 odd people died compared to about 24 or 25 on the First Fleet. It was an absolute scandal, and one of the captains was charged with murder. And that's why I think the early days in the colony have got such a bad reputation, And amongst some people, Sydney is blamed for it, but it was actually his successor. And I use those figures to show, I think, the humanity of the preparations behind the First Fleet and the difficulties with the Second. There are other things that Sydney did. Most importantly, it was his decision to appoint Arthur Phillip as the first governor. And when he appointed Phillip, or said he was going to appoint Phillip, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Howe, who was also in Cabinet, who was a good friend of Sydney's, they were good personal friends, one of the great fighting admirals in British history. And Lord Sydney said, I can't believe you're going to appoint this fellow Phillip, or words to that effect. He wouldn't have been my choice. But seeing as this is your operation, not mine, it's to do with convicts primarily, not the Navy, although 2 naval ships came here, I'm not going to try and overturn your decision. And I think the problem with Phillip from the First Lord of the Admiral's point of view was that he didn't look British. He didn't look like a British naval captain. But he was a fine man. And Sydney knew him very well. Amongst other things, he'd been seconded to the Portuguese Navy. He'd fought very bravely for the Portuguese Navy. He'd actually captained a small frigate and captured a Spanish battleship during a war in the South Atlantic. And you say, well, how did Sydney know him if the First Lord really didn't know him that well and thought not much of him? Well, the answer's in this document. Arthur Phillip was a part-time spy, and Sydney ran the Secret Service. And they did have a Secret Service, and it came under the Home Office. And one of these entries there, the one about third from the bottom, which is the second last big paragraph there, it's £150 to Phillip for going to Toulon and other parts of France to spy on the French fleets. And this is one of the reasons in a roundabout way why Howe didn't like him. Phillip was a good spy, A, because he was highly intelligent, B, because he was multilingual. He spoke French, he spoke German because his parents were German, he spoke Spanish and he spoke Portuguese. And they're the languages I know of, he probably spoke more. And he didn't look British. And that's probably a good reason, again, why he was a good spy, but also a reason perhaps why the First Lord of the Admiralty didn't like him too much. And so he was Sydney's choice. And I'm sure, as you all know, he was an inspired choice. And I certainly hold to the view that without him, the first settlement here would have failed. Of all the other people whose names have been bandied around as being the first governor, I don't think any of them would have survived in the way he got the colony through those early days after the Second Fleet arrived here, and they almost starved. Now, he and Sydney shared a number of things in common. They believed there'd be no slavery here. You might say, you know, that's an ancient notion. It was very much alive in those days. There was no slavery in Britain, but slavery was rife throughout the British Empire. So this idea there'd be no slavery in this colony was quite a new thing. Phillip was to treat the Aborigines with amity and kindness, an order that he agreed with. That might strike you as a little quaint in terms of what happened, and I can't defend what happened, but all I'll say is they came here with good intentions, and sooner or later this place was going to be settled by some European power, and personally I think that the British did it better than the French would have, or any of the other European powers that are mentioned. The ordinary criminal law would apply to the convicts. Lord Howe couldn't believe this either. He said, you mean to tell me my Marines, my men, are going to be treated to a harsher standard of justice than the convicts? They're going to be subject to military law, and the convicts are only going to be subject to the ordinary criminal law. And Sydney said, of course, they're civilians. They're under sentence, but they're not military people. And so I'm adamant that the ordinary criminal law will apply to him. And finally, Sydney and Phillip agreed that a civil court be set up here, which is to say a court in which people could sue each other. And Lord Howe said, well, that's ridiculous. I mean, you mean convicts are going to be able to sue each other? They can't do it in England. Convicts are prohibited by law from suing while they're under sentence. You're going to allow that in New South Wales, are you? And it remained an open question. So the fleet was brought together. It was a massive logistical exercise, and I'll just finish with a story which hopefully will try and wrap a bit of this up. To prepare the first fleet, convicts were brought from all over Britain, and they came from jails all over the United Kingdom down to various ships which were moored, anchored, beside quays, whatever, around various ports in southern England. to later be brought together in a convoy to proceed down south, turn left at Cape Town and travel through the Southern Ocean, etc. So convicts were being brought from all over the place. And one convict, Susanna Holmes, was being brought from Norwich Jail down to Plymouth to join a convict ship there. And she was being taken there by a turnkey called John Simpson. And you say, what's a turnkey? Today we'd call him a corrective services officer. So they made the long journey by horse down to Plymouth. Susanna Holmes and Simpson get to the vessel. Simpson goes to hand Holmes over, so to speak. And the master of the ship says, Holmes is coming on board, she's on my warrant list, but the baby with her is not allowed on board. So Simpson is quite affronted by this, and against the adamant refusal of the captain to take the child, or to let the mother take the child, Simpson decides in that wonderful English way that something must be done. I think a lovely sort of English expression, something's got to be done, and takes the baby all the way up to London on horseback to go and collar, I don't know, the night porter or the tea lady or somebody at the Home Office to demand that something be done. So they ride all the way up to London. Now, I don't have a slide of this, but the Home Office, and remember I said there are only 18 people who worked there, there's a rinky-dink old building in Whitehall called the Montague Lodgings, and there's an image of it in the book here, and it was just 4 rooms on the first floor of this ramshackle building, reached by a staircase. So Simpson starts up the staircase with the baby, hoping that he'll run into somebody. Simpson ran into no less than the Secretary of State himself coming down the stairs, probably for a sandwich, then named after the First Lord of the Admiralty and a new invention, so to speak. I don't know. He's coming down for a sandwich or not. Got no idea. So I've had this happen to me. You know, you see a constituent coming at you at 100 miles an hour with a set look on their face, and you know, you're a servant of the public, so you put a fixed smile on your face, you stand back against the wall with a defensive posture, not an aggressive posture, defensive sort of posture, an open posture like this. You smile and you try and hide what your brain is doing, which is saying, what in, and I won't say blank blank blank's name, do they really want? And I'm sure that's what Sydney would have been thinking as this turnkey approached him with probably a screaming baby. And Simpson outlined the situation, and pretty quickly Sydney decided something should be done. And so he agreed to sign the papers for the baby to go. And then he said as an afterthought, the obvious question, does the baby have a father? And Simpson said, yes, his name's Henry Cable and he's in Norwich prison. So Sydney said, well, do you think he wants to go too? And Sydney and Simpson said, well, I don't know. And Sydney, well, go and ask him, and I'll sign the papers in case he wants to go. So back on the horse with the baby, back up to Norwich Jail, asking Cable. Cable says yes. Back on the horse, hopefully 2 by now, and back down to Plymouth, where the captain of the convict transport said all papers are in order, Cable's allowed on board and so's the baby. Now, we know a lot about this story because it got reported in the press. And one of the great miracles, I think, of 18th century England was that there was this wonderful free press. And come along next week when I talk about Wentworth, and I'll try and explain why. I think it's the single most important check and balance we have on executive power in this country. You know, we have ICAC and we have the Ombudsman, we have the Auditor General. They're all very important officers and important people, and they all do good jobs. I wouldn't dare say otherwise, well, not unless I was on the floor of the House. But nothing will make a Member of Parliament or a Minister stand up and take notice more quickly or more effectively than a bit of a going over in the press. True then as now. So the press turned the Cable family into celebrities, basically, 18th century celebrities. Not perhaps like Lady Gaga or that Kardashian family, or who's the other one? Oh, Lara Bingle. Lara, not like that, but they were celebrities. And the hat was passed around to raise money for this family. They grabbed this attention, you see, and quite a bit of money was raised. And I'm sure Henry Cable would have been happy to have it spent on a keg of rum to enjoy the voyage. But in the end, sort of in want of a better expression, the trustees of this fund decided that it would be spent on books and clothing. So something sensible would be bought for this family in Botany Bay. So they went on one ship, and the books and clothing wrapped in a hessian sack went on another ship. They get to Botany Bay, and the hessian sack's been broken open, and only the books are able to be found, which will give you an idea of who the culprits probably were. They all go ashore. Cable and Holmes are married in the first civil ceremony in New South Wales, conducted by Arthur Phillip. The first civil court in Australia is set up, and then Henry Cable turns round and sues the master of the First Fleet Transport, who took his hessian sack here, for damages for losing his clothes. It's the first civil case in Australian history. It's called Cable versus Sinclair, July 1788. It's now in the New South Wales Law Reports in Volume 1, as they've recently been amended to include all these very early cases. It is the first civil case, Cable versus Sinclair. And after a hearing, Cable won. Henry Cable and Susanna Holmes won damages for lost luggage from the master of a First Fleet Transport. You just need to take that in. It is just the most astonishing outcome, and I challenge any of you to get a better result from Qantas Airlines today. So you do hear things that are written by Robert Hughes and others, and he writes about a much longer period than I've written about. I'm not saying he's wrong, but in those early days, particularly around the early days of the First Fleet, they came here with some ideas about the start to this place. And to me, this idea of a convict suing a First Fleet Transport captain and winning basically says all you need to know about the sort of philosophy behind the place. One thing I should have mentioned too was Sydney gave Phillip instructions to emancipate colonists early and to give them land grants to allow them to get a start. And along those lines, Cable was emancipated early, and he became an innkeeper of an inn called the Ramping Horse, and then pretty quickly after that he was appointed superintendent of police. Now, I used to have the most appalling fights on the floor of the House with Paul Whelan, who was the police minister and also had interest in 3 hotels, the Orient, the Mercantile and the one at Hunters Hill. And I used to accuse him of conflict of interest, and we used to have terrible, terrible fights on the floor of the House. Well, he and I have become quite good friends since we've left Parliament. The public never understand this. They always think it's a giant conspiracy when they see somebody like me and Whelan talking to each other. But we have become quite good friends, and I've invited him to my book launches. And he came along to the book launch for Lord Sydney, and afterwards, after I sort of told this story, he came up to me and said, mate, if I'd known about that story when you attacked me in Parliament, I would have been able to shut you down the first time you'd done it and use that precedent against you every other time you try to open your mouth. So he missed out on that precedent. Cable was then sacked for illegally importing pigs, sacked as the police superintendent, and then he went into business with the baby, by now a young man also called Henry. And then after a while, Henry Sr. ran into trouble with his creditors, and he was probably the first person to try what's become now an established business practice in New South Wales, which is that when you get into trouble with your creditors, you transfer your assets so they can't sue you, or they can't get anything if they do sue you. And so all Henry Cable's assets were transferred into the name of the baby, now sort of Henry Jr. to avoid his creditors, you see. And the Cable family is very distinguished. There are many descendants, one of whom is Ian Temby, the former ICAC Commissioner, and I'm sure he wouldn't, as a former ICAC Commissioner, approve of all Henry Cable's methods. And another one is Michael Egan, the former New South Wales Treasurer, who's also been to my book launches and said to me, Andrew, you never ever you accuse me of a lot of things, but you never accuse me of transferring the state's assets to avoid creditors. Now, just one final slide. It's the Great Seal of New South Wales, which was designed in 1790, and although Sydney was retired as Home Secretary, he attended the Privy Council meeting where George III personally approved this Great Seal. They're extremely rare now because they're very fragile. made out of very poor wax, available in the colony in the earliest days. But if a great seal in those days was the symbol of a government, and it was, then this symbol says, in a way, all you need to know about what the British government, the thing, and the king, I should say, believed should happen in this colony. Next week, I think. That's the seal there.